From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew. Tonight, a presidential tariff threat.
Right now, it's going on June 1st, and that's the way it is. No, they haven't treated us properly. They haven't treated our country properly. They banded together to take advantage of us.
The reaction today after President Trump threatened a 50% tariff on the European Union while promising a 25% levy on Apple if the tech giant does not move iPhone manufacturing to the U.S. We'll get into those market-moving words from the president and their impact up ahead.
This as other trading partners race to negotiate deals with the U.S. as the window to do so shortens. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent giving Bloomberg a glimpse at what we can expect and when.
We've done a deal with the UK. My sense is over the next couple of weeks, we're going to have several large deals announced.
More from that interview coming up. Plus, U.S. steel surges as President Trump announces his backing for a partnership between the company and Japan's Nippon Steel. We'll have the details.
Also tonight, a look at where a fifth round of talks with Iran stands as the Trump White House outlines a requirement of any future deal. We'll discuss those talks, a potential path ahead, and more.
And a legal win for Harvard. A federal judge granting the university a temporary block on the Department of Homeland Security's ban on foreign students that was announced just yesterday. How that case could play out and much more tonight.
But we begin tonight with the fresh wave of tariff threats emanating from the White House after the president floated a sweeping 50% tariff on the EU starting next week and a 25% tariff on Apple if the tech giant fails to move iPhone manufacturing to the U.S. Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson joins us right now with more. Wendy, welcome. Is there a strategy here? Because the market doesn't seem to be feeling it.
If there is a strategy, it is known only to one man, and that is President Donald Trump. I mean, just when it seems like the one thing we can count on with Trump, especially in the second term, is chaos upon chaos being the one certainty. So just when we thought the chaos was over, that Liberation Day had settled down, and that he was now going to take those really scary tariffs and negotiate deals with various groups, including the EU, that then, you know, there would maybe high tariffs, but there would at least be some sense to it. And apparently he didn't like what he was hearing from the EU. Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, who Trump listens to very closely, had sort of thrown up his hands about the EU and said it's going to be impossible to make a deal with them. Trump seems to have taken that to heart, and this morning smacked a 50% tariff on them and now says that's it, talks are over, it's a deal. Interestingly, a senior Dutch official said, it's just him negotiating, we'll be fine, we'll work it out. That may be, and that may be a tactic on the Dutch official's part, but, you know, it's, we just don't know.
Well, I guess we'll find out come next Sunday, at the very least, June 1st, when this is supposed to kick in. In the meantime, Japanese officials were also here in Washington today, actually negotiating with Howard Lutnick, who you mentioned. So what timing for President Trump to announce that Japan's Nippon Steel can, in fact, partner with U.S. Steel, not buy it outright, but invest $14 billion into U.S. steel manufacturing after the completion of a CSIS review. What do we know about this, Wendy?
Well, we don't know exactly what the CSIS review came back and said, but they must have assuaged the concerns that the Biden White House had, that there would be national security concerns if Nippon Steel was allowed to invest in U.S. Steel, which is what the Biden White House had objected to in this merger. But, you know, Trump has shown us numerous times now that national security concerns can be set aside if indeed he can, make money for the U.S. or get more investment in the U.S. for it. So he apparently has set those aside. And Nippon Steel will invest in jobs and, revive the aging infrastructure that U.S. Steel has in Pittsburgh. Apparently they've promised to keep the headquarters in Pittsburgh. The United Steelworkers, however, are not happy about this. They are very concerned that Nippon is going to slash jobs, bring in their own people, do all these sort of things. And there is no guarantee that that's not going to happen, and it's unclear from the White House.
Nothing is guaranteed.
Yes, nothing is guaranteed.
Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson, thank you so much, as always. Now, we want to get back to the tariff threats in particular and turn to Susan Schwab, former U.S. trade representative under the George W. Bush administration, who is joining us now here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Ambassador, when we consider a threat made on Truth Social, like the one made against the EU today, the discussions are going nowhere. Therefore, a 50% tariff will be implemented next Sunday. Is that still an effective strategy when we have seen threats made and then pulled back repeatedly by this president?
Well, that is a great question, and we'll find out. I mean, I share the frustration of those who are negotiating with the EU. It is not easy to negotiate with the EU, and Secretary Bessent, I think, was very articulate about that when he talked to Dave Westin on your show earlier today. But I'm not so sure that threatening to shoot the hostage over and over and over again is necessarily going to generate the results that you need when you're dealing with as complex a decision-making environment that those democracies are dealing with, including Brussels and the Commission. So I think part of the challenge of dealing with the EU is making them understand that we're serious. I think the president's clearly doing that, and that they ought to be looking inward and, for example, to the Draghi report and see how they can leverage the current situation and the negotiations to get them closer to what they should want to do for themselves. And many of them do want to do for themselves. I'm not sure us threatening so overtly helps them, because it just puts the back up and reinforces the anti-American sentiment and makes it harder for some of their politicians to deliver, it seems to me.
Yeah. Let's hear what Scott Bessent had to say in that conversation with Bloomberg TV earlier today and the posture this administration is taking toward the EU.
I think the president was getting frustrated with the EU. You know, the problem with the EU, I've said several times, they have a collective action problem. There are 27 countries. They all have different needs. The Germans, they are interested in cars, the French in agriculture. So, and then you have Brussels negotiating with them.
Here's the thing, though. We saw this post on Truth Social earlier today, knowing that there was a meeting set for this afternoon with the European Union's trade chief and Jameson Greer, the USTR, something you know a little bit about today. Was this just greasing the skids before their call?
Maybe that's what the president had in mind, that maybe what he had in mind when he suggested that the tariff ought to go up to 80, or in that case, down to 80 when the China negotiations were about to start. I'm not sure as a negotiator that would have been my idea of being empowered and having a strong hand. But this president interacts with his negotiators differently than President Bush did with his.
I'd like to ask you as well, Ambassador, about the separate threat the president made today to slap a 25% tariff on Apple's iPhones, and we learned later wouldn't just be applicable to Apple smartphones, but others like Samsung as well if they don't make those products in the U.S. How much harder is that to do in actuality than just to say, OK, that manufacturing comes back to the U.S.? What kind of labor considerations and technological considerations have to factor into a supply chain decision like that?
So that one puzzles me, to be honest with you. One of the challenges I think this administration has some really smart people in it, and some really smart people in leadership positions. None of them, from what I can tell, have any manufacturing experience. And while they listen to, their doors open to manufacturers, I don't think they get a sense of what actually goes into these multi-billion-dollar investment decisions. And the volatility that they've created and the volatility that exists in terms of the global competitive environment is such that those kinds of decisions are really hard to generate, particularly when you're talking about an item that everybody recognizes is still labor intensive, where the infrastructure exists elsewhere, and where, quite frankly, Apple appears to have taken the signals from the first Trump administration and started migrating production out of China to India. Mm-hmm. And so I worry that they're not paying enough attention to the services side of the equation, and that they're asking for things on the consumer side and paying less attention to perhaps the inputs that they're hiking prices on that will make U.S. manufacturing less competitive and result in disincentives for investment in the U.S. in manufacturing and services, quite frankly.
We were struck by the president's remarks yesterday when asked about tariffs in the Oval Office. He said sometimes the country will eat it, sometimes Walmart will eat it, sometimes there'll be something to pay something extra. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but is it possible this exercise resolves in balance and President Trump somehow realizes optimal tariff theory?
Personally, I don't, as an economist and as a former business person and as current chair of the National Foreign Trade Council Board, my sense is, tariffs are taxes. Somebody ends up paying taxes, and it is the consumer who ends up paying taxes. Now, that consumer is either going to be the ultimate consumer in the case of, say, an iPhone, or it's going to be the intermediate consumer in the case of, say, the automaker who's paying more for steel. Or for glass, or for whatever the input is. And so the point is, at the end of the day, if you're talking about a optimal tariff, you've got to take into account who's paying it. And it's a regressive tax, quite frankly. It goes, it's paid by those who can least afford it. The shareholder may end up paying it, but it's still a tax. And, oh, by the way, you got to factor in what happens to the competitiveness of U.S. exports, because they get damaged by U.S. higher tariffs, and U.S. exports that get hit by foreign retribution, foreign retaliation. And all of that would have to go into the mix of a, quote, optimum tariff, and color me skeptical.
Got it. Susan Schwab, it's great to have you with us, former U.S. Trade Representative under the George W. Bush administration. We appreciate the insights. Up ahead, Bloomberg's sit-down with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, as we've been describing, talking as well about ongoing trade negotiations with the EU, the president's tariff announcement today, and a lot more. But up next, a fifth round of U.S.-Iran talks concluding today in Rome. We'll look into the progress of these conversations with Natasha Hall at the Center for Strategic and International Studies next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
They also did talk about a potential deal with Iran, which the president believes is moving along in the right direction. And as the president told me, and he's told all of you, this deal with Iran could end in two ways. It could end in a very positive diplomatic solution, or it could end in a very negative situation for Iran.
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kayleigh Lines, I'm Joe Matthew. That was Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt yesterday, underscoring words we've heard from the president in the last several weeks, seeming to threaten an escalation with Iran if a nuclear agreement is not finalized.
And tonight, a deal remains out of reach after a fifth round of nuclear talks between the U.S. and Iran ended following 3 hours of discussions in Rome. But Iran's foreign minister said they were the most professional yet and could lead to an agreement in the next couple of meetings. The president, of course, has repeatedly threatened to unleash airstrikes targeting Iran's nuclear program if there is not a deal.
Joining us now with more is Natasha Hall, senior fellow with the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Natasha, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg. We hear words like further progress, but still work to be done, and it makes you wonder if we're getting anywhere. What do you make of the rhetoric coming from both sides today?
Yeah, it's good cop, bad cop on both sides, it seems. We saw that there were additional sanctions put on Iran's construction sector just yesterday. And yet today we're hearing positive news, but few details on what the positive news is really. And I think, it comes down to one final factor, which is the enrichment factor. Iran wants to continue to enrich uranium, whereby the United States says that their red line is enriching uranium. And that's kind of what it just comes down to.
Well, so how much does the timeline in regard to these negotiations matter here, Natasha? The longer they drag out, is that advantage U.S. or advantage Iran as it can kind of reconstitute itself from the losses it suffered, not just directly, but through its proxies in recent months?
Yeah, it really depends on how impatient President Trump gets and his ally Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu in particular. Traditionally speaking, time is usually on Iran's side. They like negotiations. They like a step-for-step process because it gives them time to recalibrate on the ground in the region, but as well as with their nuclear program as well. And so they like just being on the brink of potentially a nuclear program, a weaponized nuclear program, but not actually getting there. So the big question is how far Trump is willing to go. Now, the former JCPOA, or nuclear talks that were established with an agreement under the Obama administration, took about 18 months to actually sign. So, I mean, this could take a very long time. So it really depends on the Trump administration.
Iran sent a letter to the Secretary General of the UN and the Director General of the UN's nuclear watchdog promising retaliation if Israel makes good on reports that it will attack Iran's nuclear facilities. In that letter, Natasha, it says the U.S. government will also be a party and have legal responsibility in the case of a strike. Are we to believe that Iran would strike U.S. military targets in the Middle East? Is that the suggestion?
Well, it wouldn't be unprecedented. I mean, Iran has, through its proxies, attacked U.S. bases in the region that are sort of softer targets, for example, in Iraq and Syria. And so that could potentially happen again. It would make things very awkward, of course, for the Iraqi government right now. But that could definitely potentially happen. And equally with other Iranian proxies in the region, like the Houthis, this could potentially happen as well. So, I mean, they could make good on these threats, but keep in mind that Iran is severely weakened now after, a year of devastating attacks by Israel on Iran itself and Hezbollah, its proxy. So they are in a far weaker position than they were just 2 years ago.
Natasha, I'd like to ask you about news we just got confirmed from the Treasury Department after President Trump in the Middle East last week said the U.S. would be lifting sanctions on Syria. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent just saying on X, as he promised, the Treasury Department and State Department are implementing authorizations to encourage new investment into Syria. He says today's actions will hopefully put the country on a path to a bright, prosperous and stable future. Even in the absence of sanctions, Natasha, how difficult will it be for that path to be stayed on?
It's going to be enormously difficult. I mean, as President Trump mentioned, the cessation of sanctions will give Syria a chance, but it will take some time for those investments to kind of trickle down to citizens within Syria that are about 90% of them under the poverty line right now. But we've already seen some investments come through, some MOUs being signed. But the big question, I think, for me, and I think this is part of the reason that President Trump went forward with this decision, is to really keep other nefarious actors out of Syria. If Syria had stayed sanctioned, it would have to rely on Russia, for example, which it was relying on prior to this announcement, and potentially Iranian actors and others could have a foray back into the economy there. If they were really desperate. So I think that this is a very strategic move. It's a positive move, but it's certainly just one step to Syria's longer recovery.
All right, Natasha Hall, Senior Fellow for the Middle East Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you for joining us. And still ahead, Bloomberg's David Westin, the host of Wall Street Week, which airs tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, sat down today with the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, where they discussed the state of trade relations and negotiations specifically with the EU in the face of that 50% tariff threat the president made against the bloc today. We'll bring you that conversation next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. After President Trump threatened today to put a 50% tariff on goods from the EU due to a lack of progress in trade discussions, Bloomberg Wall Street Week host David Westin sat down with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent to discuss the state of play of negotiations overall.
We have substantial revenue coming in now, and there is, at some point, there's an equilibrium rate, what's called a Laffer curve for tariffs. So And I think we will reach that rate. The other thing that's happening is a lot of their tariff barriers or non-tariff trade barriers. A lot of these non-tariff trade barriers are coming down, so friction's decreasing there. And again, because we don't know where these tariff negotiations are going to end up, they won't end up being scored. But it's several $100 million a year, several $100 billion a year of revenue that will be used. For every $100 billion, that's $100 billion less of bonds that Treasury has to issue.
When you talk about uncertainty and getting more certainty because of the tax bill, some of the uncertainty, a lot of it is because of tariffs right now, because we're not exactly sure where we're going to end up. Do you have a sense when the economic community, the business community, will get better certainty on tariffs?
Well, we've done the 90-day pause. As I mentioned several times, we have 18 important trading partners. So what everyone should really focus on are those. We've done a deal with the UK. My sense is over the next couple of weeks, we're going to have several large deals announced. We have put a pause and a 90-day pause with China. I expect that we will be negotiating in person with them again. And then the president today, when we initiated the pause and the 10% are moving down from the April 2nd rate to the 10% level was contingent on countries or trading blocs coming and negotiating in good faith. And I think the president was getting frustrated with the EU. The problem with the EU, I've said several times, they have a collective action problem. There are 27 countries. They all have different needs. The Germans, they are interested in cars, the French in agriculture. And then you have Brussels negotiating with them.
You can find Bloomberg's full conversation with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent online and on the terminal. A pretty fascinating conversation there, Kaylee, as we wait for announcements on trade deals. He says there could be several large ones in the coming weeks.
Yeah, potentially, though, just not with Europe, as President Trump in the Oval Office today suggested the deal has been made. The deal is 50% tariffs.
That's right, 50% and maybe 25% on Apple. We'll be waiting for more on these. And coming up, the president's executive order focusing on the energy industry today and expanding nuclear power. We're going to dive into the details with Utah Governor Spencer Cox. As well, Isaiah Taylor, the founder of Valar Atomics, who was at the White House today. But first, President Trump's threatening a 25% tariff on Apple, as we've been discussing, if it fails to move iPhone manufacturing to the U.S. We'll explore if that's feasible next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It would be more. It would be also Samsung and anybody that makes that product. Otherwise, it wouldn't be fair. So anybody that makes that product, and that'll start on, I guess, the end of June. When they build their plant here, there's no tariff. So they're going to be building plants here. But I had an understanding with him that he wouldn't be doing this. He said he's going to India to build plants. I said, that's okay to go to India, but you're not going to sell into here without tariffs.
President Trump in the Oval Office earlier today, expanding his tariff threat to include all offshore smartphone production. That would include Samsung as well. In an early morning social media post, President said any iPhones made overseas would be hit with a 25% tariff. Apple stock took a hit, fell about 3% today. And for more, we turn now to Anurag Rana of Bloomberg Intelligence for his take on this. Anurag, it's great to have you with us. We keep hearing that this is pipe dream, not feasible. What's the reality for Apple?
See, if you take the economics out, anything is possible. But frankly, does it make sense to build lower margin consumer products in the U.S.? I mean, would you rather not invest in, higher margin chips or data center investments? And I think that's what Tim Cook needs to explain to the administration, that he is going to spend X billion dollars over the next few years to take care of some of the bigger infrastructure needs that we have, and rather worried about so many millions of phones that can be assembled, to be very honest, anywhere in the world.
Well, and what's the actual financial difference here between taking the hit on a 25% tariff on a $1,000 phone that's made and assembled elsewhere versus trying to afford the labor and all of the other higher costs associated with making that phone in the U.S.? What is that differential?
See, first of all, I think, we shouldn't be harping just on the 25%, because if the president's made up his mind that he wants the phones to be made in the US, who knows, he may raise the rates from 25 to 50% in the next, few months if the Apple doesn't really figure. The Apple needs to negotiate with the government and come up with a conclusion on this thing, because that number can, increase by several folds. The way we have looked at it is when you build a factory in, let's say, when they started building a factory in India, it took them several years, 4 to 5 years, before they were able to even make even the slight dent in the global supply chain market. According to Counterpoint data, now they are close to 20% of the global supply of iPhones. Now that's, I think, taken them 7, 8 years. So to think that Apple can do this in the US with the lack of any kind of infrastructure right now in a manner of quarters is not feasible. So for us, I think the bigger question is, can they go out and talk to the president and figure out a better way where they can spend the money, make him happy, make the administration happy, and then they can make the phones, frankly, wherever they want.
All right, Anurag, Rana, covering technology for us at Bloomberg Intelligence. Thank you so much. And we go from technology to energy now, as President Trump today gave a boost to the nuclear energy industry. In the Oval Office earlier this afternoon, he signed several executive orders meant to accelerate construction of nuclear power plants across the United States. The president was joined by industry leaders and Secretary of Interior Doug Burgum, who said the initiative is essential to keeping up with future energy demands.
What we do in the next 5 years related to electricity is going to determine the next 50, because this is the first time in history where electricity can be translated into intelligence. And we need that intelligence for every aspect of our economy, but also for defense. And this is going to help us make sure that we're providing the defense we need, where we need that AI, need the electricity, but also to secure our bases here at home and around the world.
Joining us now with more, we have two guests, Utah Governor Spencer Cox and Isaiah Taylor, CEO and founder of Valar Atomics. Thank you both so much for joining us. Isaiah, you're here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio, having been at the White House earlier today. What do these executive orders unlock for the nuclear energy industry overall and for Valar specifically?
Well, Kaylee and Joe, thank you so much for having me. I think that this is a really monumental day in the history of nuclear energy. For a long time, nuclear policy in the United States has been focused on raising barriers and raising walls. And originally, this doctrine came from the fact that the United States started off with a massive moat in nuclear energy. We were the only country that was able to build nuclear at scale. And so we wanted to protect that advantage. But over time, Russia and China have actually become better at building nuclear reactors than us. Our rivals are actually now significantly exceeding us in nuclear capacity. And so it's time for a new day in nuclear. It's time for a new tranche of policy. And essentially what this new shift is trending towards is nuclear dominance, right? Nuclear security is now nuclear dominance. We need to make it possible to build nuclear in the United States again. We need to make innovation possible. American entrepreneurs have to be able to go out, test new nuclear designs like we were doing in the 60s and 70s, and build plants all over the United States.
You're going to be activating a nuclear test reactor at the San Rafael Energy Lab in Utah, which is why we have Governor Cox with us in part. Governor, I'd love for your input on all of this, because it's not just what Valar is doing. We also had an announcement today from the White House to greenlight the Velvetwood uranium and vanadium mine in San Juan County, Utah, under an accelerated environmental review process. What does this all mean for jobs and infrastructure in your state?
Well, it's great news for Utah. Thanks for having me on. And everything Isaiah said is exactly right. We made some really poor choices that stopped us from being the dominant nuclear power in the world when it comes to energy production. When I was born 50 years ago, during the 60s and 70s, we'd built 130 nuclear facilities in this country. We've only built 2 of those in my lifetime. And so we've lost that edge. Now we have an administration that understands it. And Utah has played a key role in critical minerals when it comes to uranium and others. We are ready to start building nuclear in Utah. The holdup has been the federal government. That's been the bottleneck. We launched Operation Gigawatt a year ago, understanding that this is about national security and about helping our citizens pay less for power. We are in an arms race right now. It's an AI arms race with China and with Russia, and we're losing that if we don't get get nuclear right, we're in trouble. We're well positioned to do that. It's going to create jobs. It's going to create clean energy and cheap energy for the people of the United States. And we couldn't be more excited to be a major player in this industry.
Well, as the governor talks about bottlenecks being created by the federal government for having the kind of regulatory red tape in place, if you will, does that not exist, though, in part for a reason, given the kind of volatile nature of this kind of energy source in particular? Is there no risk here around pulling back deregulation too quickly?
You know, nuclear energy is absolutely a technology that needs safeguards around it. It's a technology like many others, like the chemical industry, that has to have regulation. But one of the most important things that you can do to make sure that an industry is safe is to do it often, right? You do well what you do often. If you're regularly building nuclear power plants, iterating, innovating, you're actually able to build safer and safer nuclear over time. And unfortunately, the regulatory environment in the United States has actually militated against this, right? We've added so much red tape that innovation becomes impossible. As an example, you know, we're announcing today that we have this partnership with the government of Utah to turn on a test reactor. You know, President Trump gave us this incredible mandate, turn on an advanced reactor in the United States by July 4th, 2026, America's 250th birthday. One of the big reasons for this is that this class of advanced reactors is much safer than the reactors that we were building in the 60s and 70s. But we haven't been able to build one yet. There has been no advanced reactor turned on U.S. soil ever. China's turned one on, Russia's turned one on, and the situation that we're looking at is that they're going to have safer nuclear than we are because we can't build anything. So I'm extremely, grateful to Governor Cox. He's been really leading the charge on technology innovation in nuclear and other categories. I think, Governor, you've been talking with my friend Augustus at Rainmaker, who's making it rain in the great state of Utah. There's all these technologies that China is really running ahead with and that we have to bring into the United States as well if we want to stay competitive.
Well, we know you're trying to do something different, co-locating thousands of small reactors into these massive gigasites, as you call them, to produce what you describe as cheaper than oil, carbon-neutral synthetic fuels. Governor, how soon will you cut the ribbon on a new gigasite in Utah if they're cutting the red tape to make that happen?
Yeah, well, we hope very, very soon. Now, again, safety is paramount, and we can do this. The technology is there. As Isaiah mentioned, one of the problems is the people who were best at doing this are aging out. I mean, the experts in the 60s and 70s all had to go to France and other countries where they've been building this, and we've lost a lot of that workforce here in Utah. So we're getting people ready. We've got these incredible companies like Valar that are doing the work. We want to turn on one of those test facilities by next year. I mean, that's what the president has asked for. It's absolutely possible that we can do that. But then there are other steps we have to go through to make the manufacturing happen. So this isn't going to happen overnight, but over the next 5 to 10 years, we should be deploying. Our goal is by when the Winter Olympics come back to Utah in 2034, that we will have operational nuclear reactors, lots of them from Valar and others right here in the state of Utah and all across the country.
And Governor, finally, as we consider time horizons here, knowing that this administration has kind of talked about its economic policy as being multi-layered, one being this kind of unleashing all sorts of energy, a broad deregulation effort, another being tax cuts that could be implemented if all goes well in Congress, but also tariff policy. And I wonder for the state of Utah, if you are expecting to feel some of the negative impact of policies like tariffs before you can reap the benefit of deregulation and lower taxes potentially.
Sure. Well, there's certainly some give and take on all of these different issues that we're working on, trying to strengthen the economy and build American dominance again. And I appreciate the president's focus on that. Certainly, we're concerned about the uncertainty around tariffs. As somebody who ran a business, I can tell you that you need certainty to make those decisions and to make those investments. And we've expressed that to the administration. I saw the interview with Bessent earlier talking about the need for that and getting these deals done quickly. We're grateful for the deal with the UK. The UK is one of our major trading partners, in fact, #1 trading partner. We want deals with Canada and Mexico because those are very important for us as well. China is always important, but and we can do that. We're headed in the right direction. If we can get those nailed down, we're seeing the markets recover, we'll be okay.
Great conversation with Utah Governor Spencer Cox, as well Isaiah Taylor, CEO, founder, Valar Atomics. Thank you so much for being with us on Balance of Power. Coming up, Harvard wins temporary court order blocking the Trump administration from preventing the school from enrolling international students. We're going to dig into this. We'll have the latest on the feud when we assemble our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We want to make cars. We don't want to have, and I like Canada very much, but we don't want to have Canada making our cars. We want to make our cars. Oh, it's a phone call. Do you mind? Hello? Okay, it's only a congressman.
Are you considering stopping other universities from taking foreign students?
It's a different congressman. They're all congratulating us.
Is that an iPhone, sir?
Yeah, it's lucky it is.
President Trump setting up the cold open on SNL and his executive order signings today, where the phone kept ringing in the midst of his Q&A with reporters. You can't make it up. When asked if it was an iPhone, the president responded, yeah, lucky it is. Kind of ironic on a day when he proposed the idea of a 25% charge on imported Apple smartphones, a new tariff threat. Joining us with their reaction, this evening's political panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, a Republican strategist, alongside Democratic analyst Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University. Ringers off, everybody. Rick, what's the president doing right now, singling out an individual company, or at least a U.S. company? I know they added Samsung to the mix here, but is this even legal?
Yeah, Samsung and anybody else who's bringing phones into the country, not being manufactured here. Look, I mean, the administration has great flexibility and power to apply these kinds of tariffs. So, yeah, it probably is legal. And the question is, what's it do for a company like Apple? A lot of shareholders in Apple in the United States saw 3% of their holdings reduced today. The market cap, $100 billion off the market cap of Apple today. Now, if you're Apple sitting there saying, oh, my God, we've just lost $100 billion, let's go cut a deal with Donald Trump and get out from underneath this, because I don't think there's anybody I've heard today, and I've really gone out of my way to try and find someone who says it's possible in the term of office that Donald Trump has to build a capacity to manufacture anything that is even close to an iPhone in the United States in 3.5 years, and not a soul thinks it's possible. So it's a political problem as much as an economic problem for Apple, as far as I can tell.
Well, and when we consider the prospect, as was raised earlier by our analyst Anurag Rana, Jeannie, there's no telling that this won't just be raised. It could go from 25% to 50%. We have certainly seen escalation in tariff threats from this president before, including also on the European Union today, which could get slapped with 50% tariffs effective next Sunday because discussions are moving too slowly. My question is, especially looking at the way markets behave today, are we still buying this when he makes these threats, knowing how frequently they have changed?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the dangers the president runs, is that these threats start not to have the impact he hopes they do. Now, one cure-all to that, unfortunately, for Apple or anybody else he threatens, is that he could pull the plug, and then he better not get rid of that ringing iPhone on his desk, because to get one from the U.S. is going to cost him a lot more money. So, you know, he made his real frustration with Tim Cook clear when he was over in the Middle East. Tim Cook was at the White House last Tuesday. And, of course, none of that has been enough. The president wants to move manufacturing here. But, of course, to Rick's point, it's not going to happen in the near term. And so what he's threatening is a real tax and real hurt on the American public. And, by the way, I'm not so sure, like Rick said, he does have the power to do this. If Congress would step up and use its Article 1 powers to be the only institution in the system that can tax. And, of course, they haven't done that. So Rick is right. It's all about Trump now.
That's such a first 100 days mentality, Jeannie. Rick, you said something important here. It's not just the idea of a $5,000 iPhone or whatever it would be. Apple shares are already dropping. This is 401ks. People don't even realize they own Apple shares. It's their retirement account that they're watching go down after all the turbulence that we've seen. Is this wise politically?
Look, it's hard to gauge what kind of political filter is on the White House, right? Donald Trump's not running again. He is individually making these decisions. It's hard to tell whether the Secretary of Commerce, the Secretary of Treasury, Peter Navarro, the trade rep, I mean, like, who's telling him that this is a good idea? Because it may be just this idea that he flips open a paper, he sees Tim Cook talking about how great their operation is in India, doesn't have to produce phones in China for the U.S. market, and that upsets him to the point where he literally can walk out, make a tweet, and that's the new policy on tariffs starting June 1st. So I don't think there's a positive calculation. Certainly, you can whip up the base and say we're bringing these jobs home here. But then when you scratch the surface, you wonder, well, what kind of jobs are those really? I mean, is anybody even going to be qualified for that kind of a job if they're not got an electrical engineering degree or some kind of science degree that allows them to operate robots and or develop software to make all that work? It's a perilous place for future candidates who are on the ballot in either 26 or 28.
Well, Rick Davis setting us up perfectly as he raises higher education and degrees you can get, and the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, in the same answer. As we spoke to Scott Bessent today, not just about the issue on tariffs we've all been discussing, but also about Harvard. Our colleague David Westin asking him specifically if the president is still moving forward with trying to remove Harvard's tax-exempt status.
And it goes a little bit back to this Main Street versus the elites, that Harvard, to have a tax-exempt status, there are rules you have to follow. And if you're not following the rules, no one's above the law. So we will see if they're following the rules. It looks like there's a substantial number where perhaps they weren't.
Following Secretary Bessent's interview with Bloomberg, the Treasury Department did issue a statement. The president is moving forward with a whole-of-government approach of reforms of higher education, ensuring that these institutions are aligned with the rules associated with the privileges they've been granted. It is an issue of basic fairness. They write of Main Street versus the elites.
Regarding tax status, they go on, whether it's Harvard or any other university, tax-exempt status is a privilege and not a right, and it is up to the established processes of the IRS to ensure that any nonprofit is abiding by its legal obligations to retain such a designation. Jeannie, when we consider this threat to revoke the tax-exempt status here, knowing the Department of Homeland Security also yesterday told Harvard it can no longer have international students at its university, though a judge has blocked that for now. What does this say about how the greater degrees to which this administration is willing to escalate the fight with this university specifically?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is if Harvard is doing something incorrect and is undeserving in the government's decision-making process of a tax-exempt status, there are ways by which we use due process to get to that conclusion. What the administration is doing right now is just a full-throated attack against an institution that it finds culturally objectionable. And that is very, very clear with all of the attacks on Harvard. And the real concern is that if there's an institution in the U.S. that can sustain these attacks, it is Harvard. What about the rest of the institutions that are under threat? And we have seen them from law firms to media outlets to many, many others, including other institutions of higher education. So there is a process, and Scott Bessent is right. If you have a process in place, by all means, they should use it. But this is not it. And so the administration's attack on Harvard is, of course, galling from that perspective. It's also galling from the perspective of the real impact it has on all of us economically, from security, and from other perspectives. And the long-term damage is real.
All right, Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Rick Davis, our political panel on this Friday. Thank you both so much. And coming up, Monday marks Memorial Day here in the United States. We'll preview the weekend next here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. This Monday is, of course, Memorial Day here in the U.S. and the USAA Poppy Wall of Honor, a temporary installation honoring the more than 600,000 American service members who gave their lives in service to our nation since World War I, will be on display at the National Mall here in Washington, D.C. for Memorial Day weekend.
It's really beautiful as we kick things off here. It's always an important weekend here in Washington, culminating Monday with the National Memorial Day Parade, marking this year, it's remarkable, the 250th birthday of the U.S. Army, Navy, and Marine Corps, all happening on Monday.
Yes, of course, we will not be here on Monday as we all celebrate this holiday together, but we'll see you back on Tuesday here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.